Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive.
Uh,
Today we're going on a journey to learn all about the Mexican wolf.
Sounds fun.
I'm really fascinated by these creatures. I mean, they were literally almost extinct back in the 70s.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think a lot of people don't realize just how close they came to disappearing completely.
Right, like they were down to just a handful of individuals.
Yeah.
How is that even possible to come back from that?
Well, it's a pretty incredible story. Involves a lot of human intervention, captive breeding, reintroduction programs.
Yeah, and even with all of that, they're still considered critically endangered, right?
Exactly. They still face a ton of challenges, habitat loss, poaching, and just the fact that their genetic diversity is so low makes them really vulnerable.
Man, it's a tough road for them.
It is,
Yeah.
but there's also a lot of hope. I mean, there are people dedicating their lives to protecting these animals, and there's definitely been progress.
Okay, well, I'm ready to learn all about it.
Yeah.
So first off, can we just get a little background? What exactly is a Mexican wolf?
Sure. So they're a subspecies of the gray wolf.
Mm-hmm.
And as you might guess from the name,
Yeah.
they're found in the southwestern U.S. and Mexico, places like Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and down into the mountains of Mexico.
Okay.
They're known for being a little bit smaller than the gray wolves you might see up north, like in Yellowstone.
Interesting. And what about their appearance? What
Yeah.
makes them stand out?
Well, they have this beautiful coat. It's a mix of tan gray rust and even some black, which is
Wow.
perfect camouflage for the kind of landscapes they live in, all those rocky deserts and mountains.
That makes sense. So you mentioned that historically they had a much wider range. What happened? I mean, how did they get so close to extinction?
Yeah, so back in the day, before European colonization, their range was massive. They were all over the Southwest and Mexico.
Wow.
But then things started changing rapidly as more people moved west and started ranching conflicts between wolves and livestock became a big problem.
I can imagine.
Wolves were seen as a threat to their livelihood, and people started killing them off in huge numbers.
Oh.
And this was happening alongside government-sponsored predator control programs, which really accelerated their decline. I mean, they were using things like poisoning, trapping, aerial shooting.
Oh, man. That's just devastating to think about.
It really is a dark chapter. But thankfully, there were people who recognized that this was a tragedy, and they started fighting to protect these animals.
So is that when the captive breeding program began?
Yeah, in the 1970s, when things were looking really dire, the U.S. and Mexican governments captured the last 7 known wild Mexican wolves and brought them into captivity to start a breeding program.
7 wolves. That's unbelievable. They really pulled them back from the brink.
It was a huge gamble, but it paid off. I mean, it was definitely a challenge to get these wolves to breed in captivity, but eventually they started having pups.
That's amazing. And then I guess the next step would be to reintroduce them back into the wild. How did that go?
Well, the first reintroduction took place in 1998 in Arizona in an area called the Blue Range Wolf Recovery Area. It was a huge moment, but it wasn't without its challenges. I mean, you're basically taking animals that have lived their whole lives in captivity and trying to get them to adapt to a wild environment.
Yeah, that must have been a huge adjustment for them.
It was, and there were definitely some setbacks, but over time they started figuring things out, hunting, establishing packs and territories.
So how many Mexican wolves are there in the wild now?
The latest estimates put the number at over 200, which is a significant increase from where they were a few decades ago.
That's encouraging to hear. But I imagine there are still a lot of obstacles they have to overcome.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of the biggest ones is habitat loss and fragmentation.
Yeah,
As humans continue to develop the land, it's getting harder and harder for wolves to find suitable territory.
right. And then you have the whole issue of conflict with ranchers.
Yeah, that's another major hurdle. I mean, ranchers have legitimate concerns about wolves preying on their livestock, so finding ways to mitigate that conflict is crucial.
So are there any solutions that are being explored?
There are a few things that have been tried with some success. Things like using range riders to monitor wolf activity.
What's a range rider?
They're basically people who go out and track the wolves and make sure they're not getting too close to livestock.
Okay.
Then there's also flagry, which are these colorful flags that have been shown to deter wolves.
Interesting. And are those methods effective?
They can be, but it's not a foolproof solution. It's really about finding a balance between protecting livestock and allowing wolves to exist in their natural habitat.
Right, because ultimately we want them to be able to thrive in the wild.
Exactly. And that brings us to another challenge, which is genetic diversity.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
Yeah.
So why is that such a big concern?
Well, because the current population of Mexican wolves is descended from such a small number of individuals, their gene pool is very limited. And that makes them more susceptible to diseases and less adaptable to environmental changes.
So it's kind of like a bottleneck effect?
Exactly, and it's something that scientists are working hard to address. One way they're doing this is by introducing new wolves from captive populations into the wild.
So kind of mixing things up a bit.
Yeah, the idea is to introduce new genes into the population and hopefully increase their resilience.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
Now, I'm curious about the role that Mexican wolves play in the ecosystem. Why are they so important to the overall health of the environment?
Well, they're what we call a keystone species, which means their presence has a ripple effect throughout the entire ecosystem.
Okay.
As apex predators, they help regulate populations of herbivores like elk and deer.
Right.
And without wolves, those herbivore populations could explode, which would lead to overgrazing and damage the vegetation and the soil.
Wow, so it's all about balance.
Exactly. Wolves help keep everything in check, which ultimately benefits the entire ecosystem.
Fascinating. So what's the future looking like for the Mexican wolf? I mean, are they on the road to recovery?
Well, it's a long road, and there are definitely still a lot of challenges ahead. But I'm cautiously optimistic. I mean, the fact that they've gone from 7 individuals to over 200 is pretty incredible.
Yeah, that's true.
And there's a growing awareness of their importance and a lot of dedicated people working to protect them.
Well, that's good to hear. It sounds like their fate is really in our hands.
It is, and I think it raises some interesting questions about our responsibility to the natural world.
Like what?
Well, we're the ones who drove them to the brink of extinction.
Right.
So do we have an obligation to bring them back and ensure their survival? Or should we just let nature take its course?
Those are some tough questions.
They are, but I think they're important ones to ponder.
Well, this has been incredibly eye-opening. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners out there, if you're interested in learning more about the Mexican wolf or how you can get involved in conservation efforts, I encourage you to check out the resources we've linked in the show notes. Until next time, stay curious.